morning. I'm delighted to be here on behalf of New York area. The fact of the matter is, the energy position of New York State is on stall. Nothing significant is happening, and that's why this panel is important to us today. Mayor Giuliani's remarks are critical to us because I think there needs to be a better understanding in all the boroughs what the future of New York City is still tied very much to whether the lights go on and whether the power is there for the things that we have to accomplish.
If we want businesses to come to this city, and if we want businesses to expand the number of people they employ in this city, we have to present to businesses a very realistic picture of growth. And there are many things that demonstrate growth, but nothing more than energy, because every business needs energy. You can't power your computers. Maybe you're not able to power your vehicles. You're not going to be able to deal with the communications equipment you need. You're not going to be able to deal with the human resources monitoring that you need unless you have electricity, unless you have power. And if you don't present a picture of expanding power, you're telling everyone who's realistic about business, everyone who makes hard-headed decisions, this is not a place to come because it's not a place to grow. Because if you are not growing, you're declining. And finally, your costs are going up. The cost of electricity is going up if you don't expand your sources of supply.
The Natural Resources Defense Council, as you probably know, issued a report a couple of weeks ago saying that the city, the downstate area, has plenty of power in order to close Indian Point. Do you have a point of view on that report?
There have been two independent reports done, one for Mayor Bloomberg, another one very recently within the last 6 months that indicates that Indian Point is critical, that if you closed it, there would be rolling blackouts throughout the city. I think the report done for the mayor is probably a lot more reliable report. And then all you need is a level of common sense. It supplies 20 to 25% of the electricity in New York City. New York City is on the brink of blackouts most summers right now. You take away 20 or 25% of the electrical supply of New York City from a place that is proximate to New York City, that is close to New York City, and you try to replace that with purchasing sources of power from much further away, you're going to create a much more precarious situation. I don't want to speak for Mayor Bloomberg, but I can tell you what this report that he commissioned says. It says that if we did that for a significant period of time, we would have rolling blackouts in the city. And there's no question that the cost of electricity would there's no question that the cost of electricity would skyrocket.
We, in a word, agree with the mayor because we think there's significant risk going forward with the energy picture, the electricity outlook in New York City. There are four big risks facing the city in its energy situation. The first is the forecasts that are prevalent right now don't think our growth over the next decade will be that great. In fact, the prevailing wisdom is it will be half as much growth in the coming decade as we had in the last decade. Well, if we're wrong at that, that's a big risk. Number two, there's a big risk if we close Indian Point 1 and 2. We heard that. The mayor very eloquently explained that issue. So that's risk number two. Risk number three is that we've made very ambitious assumptions about energy conservation. And as important as that is, as good as that is, it's very hard to realize ambitious energy conservation objectives. And if we don't realize that, then we need more on the supply side. And the fourth is we want to close a lot of old polluting power plants. That's good public policy. It's good for the environment. It's good for energy efficiency. It's good on the cost front. But what if we don't close as many as we would like to? That's a fourth risk. Well, you put those four together and they compound a situation going forward. And our conclusion is that we really need to build more transmission and generating capacity in order to address these risks. And that's what I'd like to pose for our panel.
I do agree that we need a mix Nuclear, I do think, needs to be part of the solution. Talk of shutting it down, 2,000 megawatts of supply to New York City is very irresponsible without a significant plan on making up that megawatt supply. And having lived and represented this neighborhood for so long, I can guarantee you where they're going to start looking to build them if they need to make up 2,000 megawatts, and we've got all we can take, and we're not looking to take any more.
The T&D system needs to be updated. It needs maintenance. It needs new investment, and it becomes harder and more difficult to do that literally every year because new taxes and fees are added to the electric and gas bill by government, and it crowds out the ability that we have to then take resources and invest them back into the system. So we have to stop using the electric and gas bill and customers to pay for state and local tax needs.
What do you see as the outlook for the availability and the price of natural gas?
Thanks, Dick. And I just want to touch on a few things. We currently have 4 projects on the board that are going to commence next year that are going to put approximately $500 million into our gas infrastructure. And it's really to provide 3 things: safe, reliable energy, and to support future growth. So we understand that infrastructure is important. We understand that the supply needs to be there. If I could just back up 1 second, I know we want to be short and quick, but I think as consumers of energy, we need to take charge of what we do as homeowners and business owners. There are hundreds of millions of dollars floating out there regarding energy efficiency programs. The next 4 years, National Grid's going to pump in over $80 million into energy efficiency for Long Island and New York City. These programs are real. It's an opportunity, again, for homeowners and business owners to take charge of your energy usage.
What's your experience been in building and planning facilities for New York City?
Building and planning facilities take quite a bit of time. Our facility, and we own 2 facilities in New York City, one in Queens and one in Staten Island. And our facility in Queens, it's been in active redevelopment for now about 5 years. And so the 5 years does not include the construction time frame. So what it takes to build a new facility is anywhere from 5 to 10 years. In New York City, you're going to see at the longer end of that spectrum. So when we talk about planning and things like that, you really need to be actively planning for any system needs about a decade out to be realistic. Just your permitting in New York City is difficult, but it's fair. We work very closely with the community as we were permitting our facility and things like that. So the permitting is really the longest part of your timeline. Construction of a facility from the time you break ground until the time it's operational is about 3 years. So if you figure at the low end of the spectrum it's only going to take 5 years, you really need to have a 5-year view. And if you look at the NYSO report that was cited in your study, they were saying 2019 timeframe is when we're going to have a needs. Well, we're here in 2011, almost 2012. So you really need to be thinking about what facilities you want online to be able to meet the needs in 2019, 2021.
Let's ask our panel to give us their views on what should be done with the Indian Point relicensing. Starting in 2013, one plant is up for license renewal with the federal government, and 2015 for the other. The options are not as simple as up or down. Relicensing is usually 20 years, but there might be some modification of that, and it may be that the plants could even be expanded. So should the plants be expanded, left alone for 20 years, and relicensed, phased out under some kind of agreement, or closed abruptly? Why don't we start with our elected official and ask Mike Gianaris his view.
Relicense it.
Relicensing in both cases without any conditions.
Right.
Good. Patrick?
What I always say is if they shut down Indian Point, you just build another nuclear reactor. Would be the logical thing to do, and so why shut it down? Because if it is relicensed for 20 years, it should run for another 20 years instead of having to spend all the money on building a new one. Because the other alternative is more fossil fuel, which is just completely backwards from what everybody in the world is doing, and our efforts to get the air cleaner and reduce greenhouse gas emissions would be set backwards by a great deal if we replaced Indian Point with fossil fuels, which is the only real alternative.
Kevin?
Well, we've stayed away from saying, yes, keep it open, or closing it. We're leaving that up to the policymakers that oversee the siting of generation. But we have been on record in Senate testimony. State Senate held a hearing last spring, and other places, in saying, if you do close it without having the proper resources in place, there's going to be price increases, CO2 emissions are going to go up, reliability is going to be compromised. So before we even begin to think about closing the reactors, we have to account for and put in place generation that's going to take the place.
So you're looking at a nuclear facility which has pretty much a low risk but high yield scenario, right? The risk of something catastrophic happening is low, but if it does happen, the consequences are really bad. What people don't mention in that debate is that communities like this one are dealing every day with a high risk, lower yield scenario. We have these plants that are pumping out toxic emissions. We have high rates of asthma, high rates of emphysema as a result. And this goes to Patrick's point about talking about replacing a nuclear facility with a fossil fuel facility is nuts. And there are health consequences that develop over a longer period of time and are not as dramatic as when there are nuclear problems, but they are just as consequential to people's health.
The Environmental Protection Agency did a study as to what we would need to do with all the different sources of power we have looking forward to 2050 if we actually want to reduce fossil fuel consumption by the amount that the President says we should. 150 nuclear plants would have to be part of that plan, along with all the other things. It's not just nuclear, but there need to be included in that mix 150 nuclear plants to replace the existing ones that will go offline and to add enough new nuclear power to take out a good chunk of the fossil fuel, mainly coal, that we're using to produce electricity now. So that's the challenge. But we could do it, because if we had kept building nuclear at the same rate we were in the 70s and 80s in this country, which was about 40 to 50 per decade, there would be more than double the nuclear power in the States today. It would be 50% of the electricity instead of 20, and coal would be 20 instead of 50. Exact opposite of what it is. So one of the reasons I'm so fervent about this as an environmentalist is I made that same mistake back in the 70s and 80s of lumping nuclear energy in with weapons as if everything that had radiation was evil. If it hadn't been for the environmental movement, there'd be a lot less coal plants in this country today and a lot more clean, efficient, and reliable nuclear plants.